Hello, welcome back to Theater Journal Shorts. I'm here today with Dr. Bethany Hughes to discuss her article, Remapping Relations, Contract Writers' Care and Indigenous Performance, out in Theater Journal, Volume 76, Number 4, in December 2024.
Hello, Dr. Hughes. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to have this chance to dive a little bit more into your forthcoming publication in Theater Journal. So to begin, I was wondering if you could just start by telling our viewers a little bit about the summary of the topic of the article and the main argument that you're making in it.
Yeah. So the article is about contract writers, and particularly how Indigenous female or Native American female playwrights are utilizing contract writers in what I thought were really kind of interesting ways. And so it's situating the use of those writers within ideas in Indigenous feminist theories and Indigenous feminisms to think about how these playwrights are putting formal and informal structures around production of their own work that supports particular sort of networks of community and care and relationality. And so I'm really trying to argue that these writers are like textual manifestations of embodied relational structures. And that these structures precipitate or they require like acts of care and acts of obligation for the kinds of relationships that are being either created or supported through these contract writers.
Great. Thank you so much. And how did you come to this topic?
When I first became aware of the call for papers for this issue, thinking about care, and had sort of preliminary conversations with Laura Edmondson, who's editing the issue and is editor of Theater Journal, thinking about particularly Indigenous feminisms. I'm really drawn to that field and always eager to learn more about it. So this was a space where I could sort of dig more into that literature. And I had first heard of a playwright, Larissa Fasthorse, using something like a writer in 2018. And I heard her deliver a keynote, and she talked about when she had a play produced, she challenged the theater company to have hers not be the only Native art in the season and her not be the only Native person paid for the season. And as a way of just creating space and opportunity. And then I encountered Madeline Sayet's one woman show that she toured the country with. And so the published version of that includes what she called an accountability writer for how should theater companies and producing organizations approach producing her work, and what kinds of obligations and relationships do they have to build with Native communities in order to really sort of fully articulate her vision for what her performance should even be, right? And so I saw that there was this sort of pattern developing on the way that Indigenous feminist playwrights are utilizing these kinds of things, and this invitation to sort of think about care and relationship and care work drew me to like want to sit and think of these things together.
I think it's a really fascinating combination of things because it's not, the sort of technicality of a contract isn't necessarily something we think about in conversation with care. So really interesting that you're bringing it together in the context of Indigenous performance. I was wondering how if you could also talk a little bit about, how this connects to broader projects that you're working on, or maybe even to, you've already gestured to this a little bit, but to broader conversations that are happening in the field of theater and performance studies.
Yeah, so my work is on Native American representation in theatrical performance, but also contemporary Indigenous performance, and largely theater for both of those spaces. So I'm just really interested in learning how Native American and Indigenous and First Nations artists are making theater, are thinking about their theater, about theater making, what kind of stories they're telling. But also I'm really interested in like the practicality of putting those shows together, right? Like I was a theater major major in college and spent years as a performer and did a little directing, a little bit of everything. And then I worked as a grant writer in nonprofit development for a nonprofit theater organization. And so that sort of nuts and bolts, like what does it mean on the ground to make something, is something, a question that like sort of follows me everywhere I go. And so when you have these like contracts, right, that are about what are the nuts and bolts, what is like the actual conditions of making the show going to be, that was really intriguing to me. And I think that this subject connects to larger ideas that have been, in conversation in theater and performance studies for many years over things like equity and representation, accuracy and authenticity in representational practices, but also things like equity in hiring practices and accessibility, whose stories get produced, whose stories get written, who plays the roles in whose stories, right? Like these are ongoing conversations, like sort of multi-decade conversations in the field and in sort of the business of theater. And I think this is sort of like another step, another like point to try to articulate. I also spend a little bit of time in the article thinking about the rise of, what's called like DEI or inclusion writers, that are also sort of in the post 2020, some racial awakening around George Floyd happening and seeing the need for institutional systemic changes. And so I'm trying to put together these contract writers that predate 2020 we see you white American theater, and but also like get lumped in together with the kind of like diversity and inclusion goals that people have, and really trying to create some distance to think about those things as not the same. That these writers and these informal arrangements are not necessarily about racial equity or sort of demographic representation. They're actually doing a different kind of thing. And this is where Indigenous feminisms help me articulate what it is they're actually doing, right? They're actually making relational structures and networks that honor tribal sovereignty, that preserve tribal presence and influence, that honor tribal presence and influence, but also plan for future, right? Like, how do you build the networks of relationships that come with these obligations of care, caregiving, and care receiving, right? And so, trying to get, think through all of these things together about like, what does it mean, not just to have equitable hiring practices, but to have decolonial hiring practices or indigenizing hiring practices that actually shift the way institutions view themselves in relationship to communities, to audiences, and to artists.
I think too, so one thing that strikes me about the way that you're describing this is also the movement from a set of systems and structures that can end up being almost purely transactional into this relational mode. And I think that's something that's really powerful. For undergraduate viewers who might be watching this perhaps as part of a classroom assignment, in addition to what you've already described so beautifully about the article itself and the way you're situating it, what would you say to them are the key takeaways that you'd like them to have after reading the piece? And maybe also, thinking about that in relation to, as you've already discussed a bit, the broader landscape of what's going on in theater and performance in the US today.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So there's probably sort of three things that I would want an undergraduate audience to take away. One is that tribal sovereignty and tribal futurity are key concepts, and they don't look just one way. Tribal sovereignty as a concept in conversation is most often connected to sort of um, nation state governmental recognition, US versus Native nations, and that is definitely an aspect of tribal sovereignty. In this article, I actually am thinking with some other theories in Native American studies, particularly Laura Harjo, and the way she talks about radical sovereignty in her recent book, Spiral to the Stars, which is about tribal sovereignty and ownership and planning and sort of action taking that's not actually in direct like communication with American government or some sort of like federal recognition or nation state governing practices, right? But like, what does it mean for a people to create itself, to support itself and to move itself forward within the constraints of all of settler colonialism and US federal government, right? But like that's not maybe the most interesting story happening. And so she's looking at these moments that you could miss if you didn't notice was happening. And I think that's the thing that I want to think about of like these moments of these contract writers are talking about sovereignty, are talking about radical sovereignty because they're talking about kinship and relationships and networks, which are alternative forms to sort of Western European conceptions of government and control. So that's the first thing about sovereignty and the space for sovereignty and the possibilities for sovereignty. The second is that there is a practice among Native American playwrights and artists who are trying to really actively um, interact or change structures around play performance production. And they're thinking expansively and they're thinking specifically about like what does it mean to do this play in this land at this moment in these with these people, and also how do we think as theater and performance about our own relationships to these things. So two is like it's ongoing and people are trying out some really interesting things. Three is it's hard and it doesn't always work well. The last portion of the article is actually a sort of brief discussion of an opportunity for this sort of caremaking relation building that fell apart. For reasons like you just mentioned about the way that systems of theatrical performance and production are often transactional, are often deeply constrained by financial and cultural institutions, right? Like up against these like really big obstacles sometimes for these things working. And so I included this like sort of moment of possibility of like a relational network that ensures indigenous sovereignty and futurity, like could have happened in this time and space, and it didn't happen. And the questions and the reaction to that moment when it fell apart are also really telling about the way that theater and performance, both sort of the business and the study of, are actually sort of really ready to think about what would it mean to create different systems that are healthier and whole for more people over a long period of time.
Thank you so much for all of that. It sounds like a really, really powerful ending, if not an entirely utopian one, perhaps utopian possibility, but not necessarily always what is able to happen in the moment. So for our viewers, again, I strongly encourage you to check out the longer article, Dr. Hughes's essay, Remapping Relations, Contract Writers, Care and Indigenous Performance, appears in volume 76 issue 4 of Theater Journal on care work, and performance, which is out in December 2024. So, Dr. Hughes, thank you so much again for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.